Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. Re-recording because the first time I saw a bunch of errors in my PowerPoint. You'll probably see a few more because I don't catch them very well, apparently. But let's get me to share my screen, and we will get going. Okay, sorry about the dead air time. So, welcome back to Philosophy 2200, the philosophy of Lord of the Rings. That, of course, is a joke as always. This is Ethics and Science, and today we are going to be going through an all too brief history of science. This is an introduction to the history of science. You'll be getting more of it next week in the videos that we're going to watch with Carl Sagan. The point here is to just introduce the chapter, really. So, what happens in our textbook? They start with the example of Galileo. And in truth, I think they could have done more with it, but I see the point they're trying to make. With Galileo, what we know is that he's questioning the geocentric model and that he is in some manner persecuted for it. The church goes after him. He's threatened with torture, but not actually tortured. He's threatened with prison time, but spends the majority of it under house arrest with a very wealthy friend and then in his own very lavish home because he was quite wealthy. But the fact remains that his findings were not well received by the church. The question is why? Because in Protestant Europe, and Galileo is Catholic, he's in Italy, but the Protestants accepted the work of Copernicus and Kepler, but the Catholic Church did not accept the work of Galileo. And why is that? Well, it might not actually have much to do with a clash between theology and science, and maybe more to do with political considerations. I'm going to link a entire copy of this book you see on the side of the screen, Galileo Goes to Jail. You're not required to read it, but there are a few chapters on the actual history of the Galileo affair, as they call it, and it's interesting. It could be more that certain local rulers didn't like Galileo as a person, and this was their opportunity to get him persecuted. It also didn't help that Galileo, who was personal friends with the Pope, may or may not have written him into the book as a character named Simplicio, meaning simpleton. And so he might have shot himself in the foot there. Uh, it's also worth noting that Galileo's own religious convictions, or lack thereof, are kind of a matter for debate. He does follow the direction of the church and recant his statement. However, is he doing this because he's coerced, or is he doing this because he is a genuine believing Catholic submitting to the authority of the church? Something to consider is that Galileo is quite wealthy. This is a time in history when it would be easy for him to escape to the Protestant world and publish his findings with rulers that are a little more open to them. And he does not do that. He chooses to remain and to remain under the authority of the Catholic Church. The question is why, and we don't have answers for that right now. However, what it does show is the push and pull between science and culture, that scientific discoveries are at times not welcome because they question the common wisdom of the day. Bruegel and Mitchum say that sometimes they go against common sense because the thing that functionally works for us, that we have been doing for quite a while, turns out to not be scientifically true. And that has to be proved to the general public for them to accept it. And that doesn't always go very well. We might be seeing similar things today with coronavirus or climate change, where there are significant portions of the public that are going to refuse to accept the science no matter what happens, and where alternative sciences are being created to meet the desire of the people who don't want to believe what scientific inquiry has found. It's an interesting conversation. But getting into the beginnings of science, we see that the two were actually that science and culture were sort of kept separate for a little bit. And it seems like we keep going back to Aristotle because, well, this is a philosophy class. And so let's look at sort of the ancient view of science. And something that always surprises me is how in the ancient world, science is not a super well defined term. And it's definitely not defined the way that we do it today. Science back then, for most of human history, included things like politics, poetics, which is another word for rhetoric. It included theology, and every other study we don't normally associate with the sciences that deals in rationality. And so what we call science now would have been a classification of science then called natural philosophy. And this is where folks like Aristotle, they kept their ideas to themselves among the elite at their little, groups of very intelligent and very wealthy people who could practice these things on their own. It wasn't intended to replace the religion of the general public. We have to remember that Aristotle, for all of the incredible intelligence he may have had, was quite the elitist and didn't think much of the intelligence of the average person on the street. Looking at Aristotle's sciences, though. So what we have of Aristotle's science is put into books called the Organon, where we see the beginnings of inductive and deductive reasoning, which we will touch on again in just a second here. He also made the first attempts at marine biology, which I know we don't talk about that much, mostly because all of his marine biology today would be considered not very good science, but back then it's what he was capable of doing with the tools he had, and we should recognize that for somebody who was so prolific, he had a lot of gas in the tank to study other things. He also had a huge influence on the history of science. We will see that in just a few slides when we get to our friend Francis Bacon. And also worth noting is that the complete scope of Aristotle's work is somewhat unknown. We don't have too much time for it, but towards the end of his life, he fell out of favor in Athens, and much of his work was either shelved or put away and was sort of lost to time. A large trove of it was eventually found several hundred years later, and there were people who did quite a lot of work to try and restore what could be restored, but there are some things we don't have. We've talked a little bit about Aristotle's ethics in this class, and what we have of his ethics are actually notes for lectures he would have given. Looking at what we have, the notes themselves are a little bit rough, a little bit boring. And why is that? Well, because they weren't intended to be the thing that people saw. What was intended was that people would listen to the lectures. And he was apparently quite a gifted speaker, but we don't have that. And just have to live with it, I guess. So after Aristotle, several thinkers, and this is people in the Western world dealing with Aristotle's works, there was quite a lot of interest. Somebody like Augustine was more influenced by Plato, which led him to these thoughts about the great chain of being, and whether or not those line up with Christian doctrine are a question for another time. But we can see that there was this ancient Greek influence. More influenced by Aristotle would be Thomas Aquinas. His book Summa Theologica is, among many things, an attempt to harmonize Aristotle and Christianity. Thomas Aquinas was a genuine genius. If you've ever seen a physical copy of Summa Theologica, it's like 5,000 to 8,000 pages long. He considers every possible position, including his own, and oppositions to his own thoughts that had not yet been come up with. It's a genuinely fascinating work. You should never read the whole thing, but if you're curious, find a copy. It's free on the internet, skim around. Then we have thinkers like Philo, who worked to harmonize Aristotle with Judaism, and Al-Farabi, who did a lot of work with Aristotle and Islam. And speaking of Islam, and this is not in our textbook, but it is worth talking about because a lot of cool work was done here that we don't get to talk about much in history. Nope, that's the wrong way. There we go. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad. So let me tell you about the House of Wisdom. So it came together around 1000 CE. It was there for a few hundred years in the 1000s, and most of the building blocks of scientific inquiry began here. They did not begin in Europe. How did it start? Well, with a lot of translations of ancient Greek texts that then the thinkers at the House of Wisdom built on. It came together out of a desire for genuine learning, a belief that the religious systems that they had in Baghdad in the day would not be threatened by new knowledge. And so they brought in these texts, they translated them, and they started to pick up where authors left off. There was research in astronomy that, depending on who you ask, Copernicus might have needed to make the claims that he did. You had research in mathematics. A fellow named Al-Khwarizmi creates the system that we call algebra today. He called it Al-Jabr. So if you've said algebra, you're using the English version of a word that is not in the English language, which I think is a little bit interesting. There were also discoveries in optics and medicine that, again, the world built off of afterwards. What I'm trying to say is that much of this research was later used in early European science, and we can argue that modern science doesn't exist without this research being done. Wanted to give these folks a shout out because we don't talk about them enough in Western history. Moving on to our friend Francis Bacon, though, and I use friend in quotes because I'm not so sure about this guy. So Francis Bacon was a scientist by interest, but by trade he was a politician and a lawyer. And we can see that in a lot of the actual work he did. He was responsible for quite a few witch trials, and that might reflect his view of nature. Because what is his major project? Well, it's to exercise human power over nature through technology. He believed that nature needed to be probed and interrogated, and whatever other violent metaphor you want to use to extract secrets from the natural world. He saw nature as inherently female, with this mythical figure of man, which included himself ruling over nature. And we might want to pause and think about just how much of a problem that really is. That the definition of, well, who is man gets to include people who look and act like Francis Bacon, and everything else gets classified as nature. It's remarkably convenient for Francis Bacon, not much for everyone else. And where does this project lead? Well, the accumulation of knowledge and power, with not much of a distinction between the two. And that's important. If you ever watched Schoolhouse Rock as a kid, they quote him at the beginning. What do they say? Knowledge is power. And where does this go? Well, Francis Bacon envisioned an ideal society of priestly scientific rulers in his book, The New Atlantis. It's a pretty quick read. It's only like 30, maybe 50 pages, half of which is just descriptions of machines. So it's not the most engaging read. But what he's showing there is this system that he thinks should be what society is, where you have the church and they kind of deal with the people, they deal with the outsiders, and then you have the politicians who more or less kind of manage day-to-day affairs, and then above them you have the scientists who are focused on the advancement of science, and the whole society works to benefit them so that they can continue these advancements. And interestingly enough, it's not clear that those advancements of science trickle down to the regular people, even in his own work. New Atlantis, very strange book, but it does reveal his positioning on what he thinks the purpose of science is, and almost as a replacement of religion and government. Moving on from New Atlantis, though, let's talk about his book, The New Organon. Why is it called The New Organon? Because he's trying to replace Aristotle. And how does he do that? Well, he thinks we need to start with the building blocks of reason, start over. How do we start over? Well, we need to remove the 4 idols. And those are the idols of the tribe, which is, groupthink, the way that we think together as a culture. Idols of the cave, riffing off of Plato, which is, what are the individual biases we might have? We need to put those to the side. Not sure how we do that, but he thinks we can. Then we have idols of the marketplace, which are failures of language. Language not being exact enough to say the thing that we are trying to study. And this is a question that many philosophers have asked and gotten middling results on in trying to refine language to be more exact. Then there's also the idols of the theater. And by theater, he doesn't mean plays, he means, like theaters of learning, because an auditorium is a theater. And these are the errors of traditional philosophy, which he is trying to correct by making his own brand new philosophy, his new organon. And his work here leads directly to the establishment of the Royal Society in England, which is one of the oldest scientific bodies we have. It also leads to the establishment of scientific colleges within universities. Previous to this, universities were mostly institutions of theology. Physicians, for example, were not considered doctors for a long time. They were given that title eventually, but the title of doctor actually begins with theology. And so if you look at the doctors of the church and say Catholic doctrine, those are the first people given the title of doctor, and none of them are medical doctors. Moving on, let's talk about Rene Descartes. And again, this is a little bit of a drift away from our textbook, but I do think it is helpful here. So Descartes, very similar to Bacon. You can see they line up quite well. He's born in 1596. Bacon's 1561, so he's maybe a generation after. And his major project, less interested on technology, more interested in reason, because he wants to master nature through reason. And how to do this? Well, Descartes would say, first you start with radical doubt. You doubt everything, including your own existence, and you move on from there. You break every idea, every question, everything into its smallest parts. You analyze those smaller ideas, and then you build them back together, putting the complex ideas back together until you've reconstructed reality in your head through the power of reason. Why do this? Because hopefully along the way, you find the laws of nature, and that way you can understand them and exploit them to your own benefit. Descartes is also responsible for much of what we might call mind-body dualism, the idea that who you are is not your body, it is your mind. Your mind is something separate. You prove the existence of your body by first proving the existence of your mind. And to him, humans are then primarily thinking things. We exist because we're capable of rationality. And everything that is not capable of rationality then is not living, not human, depending on whatever form of violent language you want to use there. I said in a previous lecture, I'm not a big fan of this idea of humans as thinking things. I don't think rationality is really what governs our actions, but that's a me problem, not a you problem. I would love to hear what you all think about it, though. Descartes places a high emphasis on mathematics and medicine. He is by trade a physician, and he actually gave a little bit of medical treatment to one of his primary critics, which is Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was one of the more outspoken contemporaries of Descartes to name the fact that though Descartes was saying that he was a practicing Catholic and what he was doing was in line with Catholic theology, Pascal would say, that's not really accurate, is it? Because Descartes' God, what does he do? Well, he exists as a cause for the universe, maybe a giver of natural laws, but he's not involved. And so who becomes the ruler of the universe after that? Well, the mythical figure of man, who just happens to look a little bit like Rene Descartes, right? So what does nature exist for? Well, for Descartes, nature is inert material to be used so that we can have better living through chemistry. He writes at the beginning of his meditations that he thinks that eventually this project can be used for the increase of human health and eventually maybe even eternal life. He had big goals. We still have not quite gotten there, but there is a certain Cartesian influence on modern science and even contemporary science. So what are the long-term effects of thinkers like Bacon and Descartes? Well, the first is a new emphasis on empiricism. The idea that the only things we can say are truly true are things that we can prove by studying them, by observing them, by taking notes, by experimentation. There's also a new relationship between this figure of man and nature. Nature is no longer sacred or alive in the Western mind. It's just stuff to be used for science and for the development of civilization. Whether or not we should continue to believe that is a matter of other debate. It also changes what technology is in the way that it's used. The philosopher Martin Heidegger has a whole essay about this called The Essay Concerning Technology. And to sum it up far too briefly, the difference here is that technology moves from revealing something in nature to extracting it and storing it into a standing reserve of knowledge and power. So instead of, like, I have a cup and I've revealed the cup from the clay, I've created 1,000 cups and I'm going to keep them and sell them. That's the difference. There's also a new relationship between science and religion. It's a lot more complicated now. Originally, science was done as a way of, not even as a extension of religion. The Catholic Church set up all these observatories to study the stars. Why? Because they believed that it would tell them something about their God. That was a form of worship, and now science is an end of its own. Why study science? To further science. Gain knowledge so that you can gain more knowledge, and then maybe along the way there's advancements for human health, but scientific progress becomes a thing that you work towards so that you can have more scientific progress. All through this, we have the development of scientific methods. You've probably learned the basics of the scientific method in high school. Sorry about that. So here's where it kind of starts, is we get a actual definition of a scientist from a figure named William Whewell. And his definition of a scientist is a cultivator of science, which isn't very clear, but we can go a little bit further and say that a scientist is a mathematician, a physicist, or a naturalist. Then he gives two methods of scientific inquiry, which are rationalism, which is intuition and deductive reasoning, sort of that classic philosophy of, I'm going to make a claim, I'm going to look to back up that claim. And then we have empiricism, which is observation and experimentation. John Stuart Mill comes along and says, no, observation alone is what makes good science. And then after him comes a figure named Karl Popper, who gives a little bit more definition to it and says, a scientific claim is one where you could reasonably disprove it, meaning that you have to do experiments in which the claim could potentially be wrong. Like, you want to do an experiment on gravity. How do you do that? Well, you drop something about 400,000 times, or however many times it takes to prove that, yes, gravity does exist. I have explored the possibility of it being false, and it has proven true. So, what's next? That was the end of our a little bit too brief history of science. We will get into plenty more of it next week with Carl Sagan. But for now, I want you to read this piece by Merton. It is not the same Merton that wrote the piece we read at the beginning of the semester. This is Robert Merton, no relation to Thomas Merton. Robert Merton is a sociologist, and he wrote this piece on the normative structures of science, which the next lecture is totally dedicated to. So I'm going to record that now. When you're done watching this, please go watch it. Then we also have quiz 2. We are now in the beginning of module 3. So take the module 2 quiz, do it before February 12th. And then we also have a weekly discussion post coming up soon. Details on that will be in lecture 7, because it will be a question based on what we're talking about in lecture 7. All that said, thank you all for joining me, and I'm going to record that next lecture. I will see you all soon.